we'll use the money we get from this to fund our terrorist campaign inside Nicaragua. And that terrorist campaign killed something like 30,000 civilians. It was absolutely brutal, and of course the government of Nicaragua was democratically elected. That was one of the problems from the Americans' point of view. They just won 2 elections comfortably. So something else had to be done to get rid of them. And of course, eventually Senator Kerry there was a committee set up to investigate all of this, so this is how all this came out. And what happened with Colonel Oliver North was that George Bush Sr. Pardoned him and a huge number of other people that were involved in this. And of course the list of people they pardoned is very interesting, because it's basically a list of all the people who ended up in the Bush administration. So we've got Cheney, we've got Negroponte, we've got Elliott Abrahams, we've got Poindexter. All of these people were named as part of the Iran-Contra network, but George Bush Sr. gave them all a free pardon, because there's a very bizarre rule in America that an outgoing president can pardon up to 200 people, any 200 that you choose. It's a very bizarre rule, because what it means is any president in power can have 200 people running around doing illegal things, and as they leave office, they can be pardoned. Clinton did the same thing. He pardoned a load of people who'd been doing naughty stuff for him. Anyway, but that's, again, all on the historical record. It's quite clear what was going on. Mike Rupert was the head of the Los Angeles Police Department's anti-narcotics squad. He worked with a journalist called Gary Webb in Los Angeles to uncover what was going on. They did uncover what was going on. It all came out, but of course all these people were pardoned. And of course, if you pardon criminals in that sort of context, they then think that they've got the right to carry on, and they did carry on. And they ended up in power in the US under the Bush administration, which I think explains an awful lot about 9/11. Because if you let these people get away with small stuff, they're then going to try and get away with bigger stuff. So that's that whole history of Iran-Contra. So we've got Gladio, we've got Iran-Contra. Now let's change the focus a bit. I used to be an East European expert, as you know from my book there. And in 1999 in Moscow, there were a series of extraordinary bombings of working class housing estates and tower blocks, which killed several hundred people over a 3, 4, 5 week period. And this is what I like to call, people talk about 9/11, I call this 999, because all these bombs were happened in September, the 9th month of 1999. So I call what happened in Russia 999. Now, some of you may remember Litvinenko, who died of polonium poisoning in Britain not that long ago. In his book, Blowing Up Russia, he used to be an FSB agent. The FSB is the successor to the KGB, and Litvinenko used to be a member of the FSB. And he came to Britain because he wrote his book saying, well, in actual fact, that those bombings in Moscow in 999 were not carried out by the Chechens, as the Russian government claims. They were carried out by the FSB. And at one stage, several weeks into this campaign, local cops in Moscow saw some people acting suspiciously. They stopped them and said, "When I look in your bag, open your bag." They opened the bag up. It was a live bomb, not a pretend bomb, a live bomb. They said, "Right, aha, we've got you." And you know what they did? They took out their cards and said, "FSB, we're just testing your vigilance." And of course, they got off. Now, what was actually going on there, underlying all of that, was that the ruble had collapsed. Zyuganov and the Russian Communist Party looked as if they were going to win the election in November 1999. They were well ahead in the opinion polls. This was not acceptable to the wealthy oligarchy in Russia, and it wasn't acceptable to the Western powers. So something had to be done. And what was done was to create a lot of attacks on ordinary people, and then Putin rides to the rescue. "Oh, I'll rescue you from this. I'm the sort of guy you need in these kind of terrible circumstances, vote for me." And it worked very well. The Communist Party were defeated in the election, Putin won. At that stage, Putin was actually the West's protege. They saw Putin as a man they could do business with. Subsequently, Putin has double-crossed both the oligarchs in Russia and the West, because of course, being an ex-KGB man, he knows how to play these games. So he went along with it all, to the point when he didn't go along with it all. But the point I'm making here is it's not just the Western intelligence services that engage in these kind of games. This is the way the game is played by anybody, by the KGB, by the FSB, by the CIA, whoever. Okay, so we've got Gladio, which is Western Europe. We've got Iran-Contra, which covers sort of Latin America and North America. We've got the bombings in Moscow and Ryazan, which covers Russia. And the last thing I'd like to mention, much bit closer to home, is Ireland. Now, in 1972, there were 2 simultaneous bombs in Monaghan and Dublin, which killed about 28 people. And the Irish police, the Garda Síochána, were immediately suspicious because these bombs were simultaneous. And they were claimed by an obscure loyalist group that nobody had heard of. But what the Irish police concluded very quickly was that this couldn't possibly be a loyalist group acting on its own because of the sophistication of the bombs. And eventually, after much investigation, and something called the Barron Report, B-A-R-R-O-N, which Henry Barron was a Supreme Court Justice in Ireland, and he was put on to look into this. And it's been passed backwards and forwards between the judiciary and the police and the politicians, and it's fairly well understood at the top in Ireland that those bombs were planted by the British security forces. And in other words, that just as the IRA were going around bombing people at random, as they did in this city, the British security forces were doing similar things in Ireland. But of course, it wasn't at random. The reason behind those bombings in 1972 was to force the Dublin government to bring in repressive legislation against the Republican movement. So from the Republican movement's point of view, the British bomb the Republic, killing 27 people and wounding hundreds of others. And at that point, the Dublin government knuckles under and brings in repressive legislation against the IRA, who are not responsible for these bombs at all. But of course, the British view of that would be, well, you're bombing us, we're bombing you, it's tit for tat, off we go. Now, I think there's something to be said for that, but at the same time, you can't do that and then pretend that you're squeaky clean, because you ain't squeaky clean. Now, just to finish this Irish thread, the Force Research Unit in Northern Ireland, sometimes known by other British Army groups, British Army people as the Green Slime, they were run by a guy called Colonel Gordon Kerr. He's subsequently been promoted to brigadier, but he was only a colonel in those days. And there was an investigation of what they were up to, carried out by the Metropolitan Police, or rather Sir John Stevens eventually became head of the Metropolitan Police. He was the head of the East Anglian Police at that stage. He was based in Cambridge. And they did a further investigation into everything that was going on. They were about to produce their report about what had happened. And then they had a special set of rooms at Castlereagh Barracks outside Belfast. And then, just as they were about to produce their report, all the evidence that they collected was burned in a mysterious fire. But Sir John Stevens went on TV and said, well, I thought that one might happen. So what I've actually done is I've got all copies of everything, all of my documents. I've got copies of all of them at my headquarters in Cambridge. So this fire is not going to prevent me going forward with what I'm going to bring out. And basically what he was bringing out was that the British Army, through the Force Research Unit, and we're not talking about ordinary squaddies or even ordinary officers in ordinary regiments. We're talking about, a secret group. Basically, the Loyalist terror campaign, the terror campaign carried out by the Ulster Volunteer Force and the Ulster Defence Association, was being orchestrated by the British Army. Of course, a lot of people in Ireland know this, but not so many people in Birmingham. Now, it's just come out in these WikiLeaks today that it's well understood on all sides that the murder of the lawyer Pat Finucane, who was a sort of human rights lawyer, was carried out by the British state. Now, the reason I mention that is, I mention all of these things is just to show that we've got a documented track record of this kind of activity as a means of achieving political goals. And this is before we come to 9/11 or the London bombings or more recent incidents. Now, the reason I approached this, when I spoke at Birmingham Central Mosque this time last year, or 18 months ago, I didn't particularly discuss 9/11 or 7/7. There's plenty of stuff out there on the internet about both of these things. We made a film about 7/7, and the main point I would make about 7/7 and the London bombings is we don't know that that was carried out by the intelligence services, but it's perfectly reasonable for us to suspect that it might have been. And of course, I think right-thinking people should condemn terrorist attacks, whoever carried them out. There is no excuse for killing innocent people in this way. There never was, there never will be. The point is, who is actually doing it? And I think increasingly people like yourselves are beginning to ask questions. When we hear about the latest plot to do this and do that, like supposedly this guy from Luton that blew himself up in Sweden this week. Well, we've got stuff from the Swedish press saying that somebody from the Swedish military phoned up their friends the day before and said, make sure you don't go downtown Stockholm tomorrow because something's going to happen. And again, this was on the internet today and yesterday. There's always going to be a suspicion that something else is going on here than we think is going on. Now that doesn't mean that we haven't got what the technical term is patsies. People who are being tricked into participating or even think that they are participating. Many of the Red Brigade activists in the 70s, and I used to know some of these people indirectly, they were genuine people, but they didn't realise that their organisation itself had been infiltrated and directed. And I think groups like Al-Majid Haroun, for example, are clearly linked with the Western intelligence services, particularly MI6. Melanie Phillips, who's a sort of right-wing commentator in the Daily Mail, she keeps going on about what she calls Londonistan. We've got all of these extremists all over the place in London. It's the capital of Islamic extremism. You say, well, there's a reason for that, Melanie. The reason for that is during the 1980s, the MI6 were the lead agency for what was called Operation Cyclone, which was basically the arming and training of the Islamic resistance inside Afghanistan. MI6 were given the lead role on that by the CIA. So all of these extremists were invited from all over the Middle East, from all over the place, to come and live in London, because that was where we were going to orchestrate it all from. And Operation Cyclone, at the time, the head of the CIA was a guy called Robert Gates. Robert Gates is now the US Defense Secretary. So when Robert Gates says, oh my God, we've got to do more to stop Al-Qaeda, if you like saying, well, if you were given a bit of waterboarding, mate, we might find out what Al-Qaeda really is, because you set it up. Robin Cook, who used to be the Foreign Secretary, he said, not long before he died, he said, we all know that Al-Qaeda simply means the database. It's a database of all the people recruited by the Western intelligence services to go and fight in Afghanistan. That's what it is. And it was a database held in Amman in Jordan, and MI6 were the lead agency on this whole game. Now, call me stupid, but it seems to me that if the Western intelligence services set all these groups up, the idea that they suddenly went feral and disappeared and we don't know what they're up to and we've got to take away your liberties, we've got to tell you what to think, we've got to stop you saying things because we've got this terrible threat from these Islamist extremists. Hang on a minute, you orchestrated and organised all of this. It's not disputable, we know you did. And what's really telling is it's the same personnel. Robert Gates, all these Iran-Contra criminals in the US, they should have been sent to prison for 35 years in the 80s. But they weren't. They're not only not in prison, they're in power. And if people want to ask why we're in a mess, that's why we're in a mess, because we haven't got a rule of law. Now, to make a more positive point, in Ireland, after all the suffering and all the fighting, there is actually a genuine desire on both sides now to bury the hatchet. And I've seen people from both sides talking to each other in a very civilised way and a very informed way. Even loyalists understand, for example, not even loyalists, they especially understand what I'm talking about because they've been involved in terrorism and they know what terrorism is and how it works. And I think that what's happened in Ireland is actually quite positive, but one of the aspects of that is that there's got to be an independent police force which isn't politically motivated, which will catch whoever's doing what the bad stuff is without fear or favour. And that is